Shiloh, April 6 and 7, 1862. This is a new game by Worthington Games. It is based on a classic game system for the American Civil War that you may know from back in the day, from the game Chickamauga, River of Death. Also more recently from Antietam by Worthington. That was the first game based on this system. So that's one of the advantages, of course, of having game systems, because although I love wargaming, I never was able to fall in love with reading rules and studying law manuals. And so the idea that you have games based on the same system of course facilitates the process of learning the game. You only have to reread the rules, easier than read them from the first time, and then of course you have to learn the specific rules for the system. Shiloh 1862. So yes, we are back at Shiloh, one of the most gamed battles of the American Civil War and possibly in all of wargaming. Maybe for the American Civil War, second only to Gettysburg. It is a two-player game, but you can play solitaire easily. All information is available. There is no secret information. You can play both sides to the best of your possibilities, and that is how I played it. Here you have the board. It is a mounted board. It looks very nice. It is very functional. You have a lot of tables here, almost everything that you need to play the game. There's also player aid for what is not there. And then we have the map. Nice looking. Hexes are very large. Game pieces are also thick with not a lot of information printed on, with large numbers. I've heard somewhere that this is meant to be senior friendly, and one wonders why, because when I said that wargaming is a hobby for an aging crowd that is not being replenished by new gamers, that was harshly criticized. So I wonder why there are crazy publishers doing stuff that is senior friendly. And you don't hear Magic the Gathering coming out with a senior-friendly set, do you? Back to us. We're at Shiloh, so the Union player will set up their units in the middle of the map. There are reinforcements that will come in later, but until then things are tough because you have waves of Confederate units that will come out of there and will attack you from different directions. Basically, the Confederate player can choose for a two-prong attack from this road and this other road, maybe even a three-prong attacks, maybe a massive one-prong attacks, but that's not probably advisable because then you get in a traffic jam and you don't get to really move all of your units, bring them to bear. Terrain, of course, is a big element here because outside of the roads, movement is difficult and complicated because of the woods that slows down units. Artillery is not gonna be a big deal. You artillery guys, you're not probably gonna enjoy this one too much because the artillery is sort of like lagging behind the constantly moving front. Also, the artillery, you need to limber it, unlimber it to move it. It's one of those games. And so you're trying to bring it to bear and to get it to fire, but by the time it is ready, maybe the front already moved, and in any case, you don't have a lot of range because you don't have a lot of visibility. So artillery, not a big deal here. Now, I'm gonna tell you about the combat, the game system in general. You may remember this from my review of Antietam, but in case, I'm just gonna refresh the general idea for you, and then I'm gonna tell you about the specifics that you find in this game, the capture, the flow of Shiloh, and then make it different from other games in the system. But there are not many rules, really, if you know the game, the previous game. It will be very easy for you to get started with this one. So we were saying that combat units are represented by large, thick, senior-friendly counters with not a lot of information on them. We have artillery, cavalry, and you can then place you can keep it mounted, or you add a marker that indicates it's dismounted, then it gets to attack at a better rating. Infantry, of course, and then we have leaders indicated by the star there that will give advantages to your units. I'm gonna put them sort of randomly, not necessarily how they are set up this way. You get a sense of how things work. The large number that you see on a counter is the combat value. So as you can see, it can get pretty high, 26, 17, and when a unit takes a hit, it sometimes just loses 1 point of strength or 2 points of strength. Then you will need to keep all of these counters here handy because you will constantly adding, removing, adjusting, rotating these counters to indicate the unit was a 26, those took 2 damage. Then you look for the counter that, well, you probably want to organize them before the game starts, that says 24, and you put a 24 under or on top of that unit. The color in the background of the number indicates the morale of the unit. The value is green is 5, black is 7, gold is 9. When a unit takes about half of its initial hits, it is flipped to the other side, on top, of course, doing applying the usual adjustments to the numerical value of the life points left. So you flip it to the other side, and usually then you get a lower morale value. Leaders are important because they give you a morale bonus during morale tests, and also they are important for coordination, for command. Now, during each turn is divided into 2 players' turns. So first player turn and then the second player's turn. The first player first checks command, which is checking that all the units under a commander are within range of 4 hexes from the commander. As you can see, units are organized by color bands, and also they have the name of the commander under the color band, and the commander has the name in the color band, and so that's how we know who is commanded by whom. If people are out of command, then you place a marker there to indicate that, and those units cannot move adjacent to enemy units. So you check command, you check organization, that is, you have an organization phase, which is where in other games in the system you can build breastworks, you can burn bridges, you can search for forts, but you don't have to worry about any of these things here. That doesn't apply. So again, not the most complicated game that the system can possibly produce. So ignore the organization phase in this game. Then we have the offensive artillery. Well, all artillery units that are ready to fire, that are on their ready side, then they can fire. And you resolve combat, and we'll talk about that later. Then we have the first player, that is the active player movement phase. It's pretty standard. You move up to the full movement allowance of the unit. Moving by roads and not in the proximity of enemies allows you to move faster. And then, of course, we have combat, what everybody wants to know about. And so let's put some enemy units there for the fun of it. Now, combat this is a game that does take into account the advantage of being the defender, the advantage of shooting at the opponent as they march towards you. Very important for the American Civil War. So during the combat phase of the first player, the second player gets to fire first. So first player moves, and you know the units. Then the second player performs defensive fire. Then whoever is still there performs offensive fire. Then the first player has a rally phase in which they may try to take a morale test with the units that have lost, that are disorganized, that are routed. And that's the idea. Then the second player goes through all the steps. Moves. The first player performs defensive fire, and then the second player performs offensive fire. So each turn, during your turn, the opponent gets a chance of shooting at you first with any and all units that apply. Combat, pretty simple. For range combat, well, there may be modifiers based on the range. Say artillery fires so twice its firepower when adjacent, fires at its own firepower, 2 to 5 hexes. Infantry and dismounted cavalry, they only fire in their adjacent hex at their normal power, and mounted cavalry fires at half of its power. That's why you may want to dismount it when it's time to fight. Then, simply, you total all of the strength points that they're firing at a unit. Suppose these 2 units are firing against that one, that would be a crazy 48. I look at the combat table, that would be 33 plus. And that's it. I roll a die. The game uses 10-sided dice. I roll a die, I cross-reference the result, and I see what happens. It may be step losses, it may be step losses and retreats, it may be retreats, and after you retreat, you also take a morale test. It may be just a morale test. And of course, if you don't go that high, you simply look at the closest column, say 25. 25, I would be here, hooray! But if I was 24, well, then I would be in this range here. So you simply look at the column that applies and perform that roll. This is important. This is important. Terrain effects, of course, are always important, but on this map, -2 if the target is in woods terrain, that means that you almost always have -2. That means you will have a lot of grinding to do because you have a lot of attacks to do. 1 point, 2 points, 1 point, 2 points, retreat. But when you have those units that are 26, well, it'll take you a while to push them all the way out or to really do a lot of damage. Because it's all woods, it's Shiloh, you should expect that. I mean, this is pretty much the general idea. Then, of course, you have terrain modifier on the other side of that of the player aid, but it's pretty simple. When you have a morale check, you roll a die, apply possible modifiers, say based on the presence of a leader, and if you roll equal to or lower than your morale, you're good. If you roll higher, then you fail and your unit routes. And again, you have penalties based on that. These are the general ideas about the combat system, the game system, ideas that apply to all games in the system. What makes this game more specifically Shiloh? One, again, the map right there. You know where we are and you know the kind of trouble that we are facing. Then we have Union gunboats. So we have 2 game pieces. They can be moved anywhere along the river every turn. They have infinite movement value, so to speak. They can fire Confederate units up to 4 hexes away. They don't do damage in terms of strength point reduction, but they, if they hit, they force the opponent to take a morale test. So they just make the Confederates a little sad, a little bit unsettled. Most importantly, we have the fact that the units of the Union are not ready. They're just taking their nap, having their breakfast, and so all unit of the Union player on the map start under an unalerted marker. Of course, they wake up when the enemy gets closer, when the enemy attacks them. We don't need to get into the details, but the idea is that the Union player will be able to activate their units only gradually by group and depending on the action of the enemy. When a Union unit is activated, you put it on top of the unalerted marker, but the alerted marker still stays there. If then the unit retreats or is eliminated and the Confederate player enters the area with the unalerted marker, then looting occurs because it's so hard not to stop to pick up some souvenirs, some little mementos. What happens when a Confederate unit enters an unalerted marker space with an unalerted marker? Then you roll on this table here, which is on the board, and you will lose a number of strength points, which is funny because it's called the straggler recovery table, but which is used also later during night turns when you can recover stragglers, but it is also used to determine the stragglers that happen that you have to suffer when a Confederate unit enters a space with an unalerted marker. There's a one-time check. After you take that check, you remove the unalerted marker. And so that's gonna be that's not gonna make a big of a difference really, but it has that flavor. It has a little bit of historical flavor. The biggest influence on the game is, of course, the fact that most of the Union units are not available, are not active at the beginning of the game, and that influences the opening turns of the game, and then based on what happens there, of course, it influences, well, the rest of the game. Shiloh, April 6th and 7th, 1862. This is a game about a topic that interests me. I don't know how many war games I've played about Shiloh. I know it's a fair share. And there is always room for one more game about Shiloh in my collection because it's an appealing theme. In a sense, it's the perfect battle for wargaming because it has an architecture, it has a structure, it has a back and forth in which you have a lot of tension. As one side, the Confederates at the beginning always seem at the point, close to the point of causing a catastrophic defeat on the opponents, and yet the opponents have a fighting chance of resisting until the tide turns, until reinforcements come in, and then, well, you have a second act. So just the history of the event just so happens to have a sort of narrative structure of a tragedy in multiple acts, which works very well in wargaming because it gives both players the chance of being the defender and the attacker, and because it creates very tense situations, especially early on in the game. So that applies to every game about Shiloh, say every good game about Shiloh. And this one is a good game about Shiloh. I like the fact that the system is so simple. I like even more the fact that this simple system, I knew it already from the classic games it is based on, and from the previous iteration of the system with Antietam. Always happy to play a game that I already know how to play, especially if it's a new game that I already know how to play. Beautiful paradox there. And that's how I like to play games. Not a big fan of studying rules. That's the necessary evil, I believe, if you enjoy historical war games. I envy those that enjoy reading rules. I'm not one of them. Now, this game, so it has those advantages of Antietam, of the other basic games that you have based on the system, which is so simple. It's basically as simple as move and attack, move and attack. Well, move, be attacked, then attack, move, be attacked, then attack. The fact that the defensive fire comes first, of course, adds that added tension, adds a thematic element, which is very important in this scenario here. Now, when it comes to this specific implementation of the system, I find that Shiloh worked less well for me than Antietam. I enjoyed Antietam more. Shiloh, just the system here with those large units that start with 24 or 26 strength points, and you had to grind them down 1 point at a time because of the woods, because of the constant penalties there. I found that slowed down the pace of the game and made it a little more repetitive, a little less exciting than say Antietam. And that's kind of like the problem with this game that I have. I still like it overall. It's just less exciting, and towards the middle of the game, it can get a little repetitive because you have the first exciting turns in which the Confederate player will have to choose the points, the directions of the attack. That's key. That also determines which divisions of the Union player activate and when, and so then they're scrambling around and trying to form a defense as the Confederates keep pushing, try to inflict damage, try to prevent a line from forming, surround the opponent so you can pile up strength points against small groups or individual opponents. But it's hard to do so because the woods dampen the power of your attacks. It's hard to achieve that Clausewitzian shock. And so what happens is that you will have weakened units of the Union that most likely will be able to form a defensive line. There's still tension, it can still be exciting, but after a while when that line is formed, you have a little bit of World War I trench warfare effect because you will have turns in which not much moving or maneuvering happens. It's about minimal adjustments, so I can have 30 points in that attack and 25 in that one, as I'm just slightly moving, and most turns towards the middle of the game, towards the end of the first day, will be just declaring attacks and not much movement. And that, of course, is repetitive, and that, of course, is less exciting. So, I would say part is the nature of the battle, but I have played games about Shiloh that were tense throughout the entire game. Maybe here is the simple system, which is great, but then when it gets to that phase, it feels a little repetitive. It feels like maybe I would like a little more here, something else to do, some other little elements that you can exploit, because other than piling up big numbers here, terrain is uniform because it's always the woods, virtually always the woods. The artillery don't do much. So it really, because of the nature of the battle, combined with this very simple system, the heart of the game, the central part of the game, really bogs down to a constant back and forth, and that just makes the game a little less interesting. When the Union comes, reinforcements come, then things become a lot more interesting. But then again, you may find yourself in a different situation. Now the Confederates have formed a solid or decent, strong enough line of defense, and then again you go back and forth. So because the woods are everywhere, terrain is not so interesting, artillery is not much of a factor, and you don't inflict a lot of damage, the game becomes a little more of a repetitive grind that I would like in general from any war game, and that of course does not have to be with Shiloh. You can have the specific situation of fighting in the woods with limited visibility and yet that being more exciting. The Shiloh by Columbia War Games, for example, does that. So here's my review of Shiloh. I like the game system. I don't dislike it. I sort of like it still. But it can get a little repetitive and a little tedious in the advanced phases of the game just because you're rolling a lot, not doing much, and so you're doing the same thing over and over again. So not my favorite game in the system, not a terrible game either, but not my favorite game either. So mixed feelings about this one.